The historical proof for Jesus' physical resurrection remains so compelling, believers voluntarily endure the terrible persecution of Emperor Hadrian, who killed approximately 10,000 Christians during his reign. His favorite method of execution was to crown Christians with thorns before crucifying and thrusting spears in their side to cruelly mock the death of Christ. The continued faith of early 2nd century Christians in the face of death was so astounding it caused pagans such as Calconus to exclaim, "Great is the God of the Christians." Calconus was immediately put to death in 108 AD for his faith-filled declaration. As an example of the many ancient Christians confident on a death, consider the resolve of 2nd century martyrs Sanctus, Perpetua, and Genesius. Sanctus, while enduring prison as well as the placement of red-hot plates and chains on the most sensitive parts of his body, boldly affirmed prior to his beheading that, "I am a Christian." Perpetua, who was forced to decide between her newborn baby and husband, her faithfulness to Christ, offered these final words, "Do not be ashamed of my death. I think it is the greatest honor of my life, and I thank God for calling me to give my life for his sake and in his cause. He gave the same honor to the holy prophets, his dearly beloved apostles, and his blessed chosen martyrs. I have no doubt that I am dying for God's cause and the cause of truth." She confidently faced imprisonment, the wrath of bulls, and death by stabbing for Christ. Genesius of Rome stated prior to his martyrdom, "There is no king but him whom I have seen. He it is that I worship and adore. Were I to be killed 1,000 times for my allegiance to him, I should still go on as I have begun. I should still be his man. Christ is on my lips. Christ is in my heart. No torments can take me from him." Historical evidence for Jesus' physical resurrection must remain incredibly strong during the centuries immediately following his ascension, for we have no record of permanent recantations by Christians. In contrast, we possess written documentation relatively early Christians' faith in the resurrected Christ remained steadfast, despite unimaginably miserable torture and death. For example, Blandina was twice imprisoned, scourged, and forced to sit naked in a blistering hot metal chair, partially eaten by lions and tossed on the horns of a wild bull before finally being stabbed to death. Felicitas was also badly gored by a bull before a gladiator killed her with a sword. Felix and Philip were clubbed in the head until their brains literally fell out. Sylvanus was thrown from the top of a building. Revocatus was stabbed multiple times and devoured by wild beasts. Apollonia was burned to death. Alexander, Vitalis, Martial, Felicitatus, Leonidas, Plutarchus, Serenus, Heron, Heraclitus, Arrhenius, and Martina were beheaded. Justin Martyr was scourged and beheaded. Saturnius endured a confrontation with wild beasts, was stabbed, and finally beheaded. We also know the decapitated heads of Roman Senator Pomacius' family and 42 other Christians were publicly displayed on the city gates as a sign of Roman sovereignty. Metras was pricked with needles, beaten with clubs for his refusal to worship idols, crucified and stoned to death. Quinta was scourged and dragged over a bed of sharp flint stones before being crucified and stoned to death. Rheius was scorched with boiling tar applied to her head and later burned alive with her mother Marcella and sister Pontinia. Basilides, a Roman soldier, became a Christian after witnessing Pontinia's execution and was later beheaded for his newly declared Christian faith. Januarius was crushed to death with heavy weights. Hippolytus was dragged through the streets by wild animals, and a heavy millstone was placed on Calipodius' neck before his body was tossed into the Tiber River. Beyond these tortures, Christians living within the first few centuries after Jesus' resurrection were also willing to be smeared with honey and stung to death by wasps, sealed in a leather bag with snakes and scorpions before being thrown into the sea, boiled alive in hot water or oil, scorched with torches, trapped and burned to a crisp within their own houses. In addition, they were broiled slowly upon a hot gridiron while a spiked plate pressed from above, had their eyes burned out with a red-hot iron, were sawn in half, poisoned, speared, hung, strangled, nailed on posts, shot with arrows, thrown in Roman sewers to die from the inhalation of noxious fumes, blown up, torn with sharp hooks, ground to death by the millstones within a grain mill, hunted like wild animals and mutilated. During the fifth great persecution under Roman Emperor Severus, the dead bodies of Christians were actually taken from their graves and dissected. Further, early Christians endured the removal of their ears, nose, teeth, eyes, breasts, feet, and other body parts, were trapped in a sealed cave until they starved or died of thirst, were forced to drink rancid, filthy oil until they died, were made to walk on thorns, nails, and sharp shells after their feet had been crushed in presses, and were laid naked on a bed of hot coals and sharp glass after being scourged. Finally, they had their bodies stretched by ropes until their limbs were ripped off, were placed upon a stretching wheel until all their bones were crushed, and were dragged down steps by wild bulls until their skulls were crushed and brains fell out. The 2nd century historian Tertullian, who became a Christian at age 38 after witnessing the courage of believers facing torture and death, stated, The Christians are to blame for every public disaster and every misfortune that befalls the people. If the Tiber rises to the walls, if the Nile fails to rise and flood the fields, if the sky withholds its rain, if there is earthquake or famine or plague, straightway the cry arises, the Christians to the lions. Tertullian added, Jesus' disciples also spreading over the world did as their divine master bade them, and after suffering greatly themselves from the persecutions of the Jews, and with no unwilling heart, as having faith undoubting in the truth, at last by Nero's cruel sword sowed the seed of Christian blood at Rome. Despite such incredible torment, Tertullian reported if all the Christians existing at the end of the second century AD had left the Roman provinces they were residing in, then the empire would have been nearly empty and greatly weakened. Such unprecedented Christian population growth would have never happened unless Jesus' resurrection was a physical reality. Eusebius of Caesarea, considered by many to be the father of church history, recorded the following personal witness. We ourselves have observed crowded together in one day, some suffering decapitation, some the torments of flames, so that the murderous weapon was completely blunted, and the executioners themselves, wearied with slaughter, were obliged to relieve one another. Then we were witnesses of the truly divine energy of those that believed in the Christ of God. They received the final sentence of death with gladness and exultation, so far as even to sing and to send up hymns of praise and thanksgiving until they breathed their last. According to John Fox, nevertheless, despite persecution, the church continued to grow, deeply rooted in the doctrine of the apostles and watered with the blood of the saints. He added, for 300 years, during the first 10 persecutions, the strongest and richest rulers in the world had tried to snuff out Christianity, using force, politics, torture, and death, everything at their disposal. Now all those emperors are gone while Christ and his church still stands. As Tertullian observed, the blood of the martyrs is the seat of the church. The massive variety of tortures voluntarily endured by members of the early church is unparalleled. Truly, no other group of followers from any other world religion has experienced such horrific affliction over a 250-plus year period. The joyful steadfastness of first-century Christians, who could have known the truth with great certainty, as well as later believers in the presence of extreme persecution, is simply unexplainable unless Jesus' resurrection was a physical reality.